Welcome, listeners and viewers. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with Patty, the paranormalist, and also known as the Ghost Lady of PA. Patty, how are you today?
I'm just fine. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for asking.
All through the Christmas holiday, and we're headed into the new year, and more ghost stories and all kinds of craziness to come.
Excellent. Yeah, as we record this, it is New Year's Eve day, so we wish everybody a happy New Year's.
Yes, indeed. So today I was going to talk a little bit about the black-eyed children, which is something I had been promising to talk about. I took a little detour for Christmas ghost stories, but I wanted to get back to it. And I have to tell you, I often, when I'm speaking at book signings and things like that, people ask me what are the things that frighten me, and there are two things that frighten me. One of them is the black-eyed children. The other is UFOs. I have to tell you, when I wrote Pennsylvania's UFOs, it was honestly the most freaked out that I've been in many, many years. I always write at night because it's when I have the free time. And I caught myself having to get up early in the morning to do it, because sitting there, with the black window right beside me as I'm writing, and it was like, what is out there? UFOs are just creepy to me. And some of the stories, because I met the people they actually happened to.
Okay.
But black-eyed children actually are another, as I said. I have to tell you, preface it by saying that one of the reasons I find it so terrifying is that I actually know somebody that had an experience with them. And it's a person who's here local in my region. And I'll tell his story before anybody else's. When he was a really young kid, he was a pizza delivery guy. He was about 20, 21 years old. And this was a cold, kind of rainy, gray November, early December, Sunday afternoon. And he's delivering pizzas for one of the local pizza shops in the town I live in. And he's going out this road that is kind of rural. There's like, a house every quarter mile or so. And it kind of pans out into a really, really open rural area where there's no houses for a good few miles. And then back to there being a few houses scattered along. And if you take the road to its termination, it will actually take you into Maryland. And he's just driving along with a pizza, looking for this address. And he sees these two kids coming down the road. The boy looked to be about, 14 years old, something like that, 13, 14-ish, and a little girl about 7 or 8. And it was just that cold, freezing, miserable rain coming down. And it caught his attention because there were no houses nearby. And he was like, where the heck did these kids come from? What's going on? So he passes them and goes up the road, turns around, and thinks they must need help because there aren't any houses around at all. And he starts back down, and as he comes down, they had stopped, like they knew he was coming, and they were standing along the edge of the road. And he said he pulled up closer, and the boy looked up, and he had on like a big bulky hoodie and had the hood part up around his face. But whenever he turned to look directly at this person, he could see that the kid had he said, just black holes for eyes. He said it was just black, completely black. And then the little girl, he said, I glanced at the little girl, and she was smiling like they were oblivious to the cold rain. And just like she was excited in anticipation. And he said the bottom of his stomach just dropped completely out. He was terrified. He took off down the road. He caught himself, and he's like, what the heck is wrong with you? These are kids in the middle of nowhere in a freezing rain. You need to go back and see if they need help. And he turned around again, and he went back up. He said he got close, and again, that terror, that absolute skin crawling terror. And they're still standing there smiling at him like they know they got him. And he slowed down again, began to wind his window down. And he said he didn't even realize he was winding the window down. It was almost like it was happening automatically. And that scared him. He caught himself, and he quickly wound the window back up real quick, and he took off again and up the road a little ways, turned around, and he said when I came back they were completely gone, and there was no woods. It was just open fields and no houses, no barns, no nothing. He's like, I have no clue where they went to.
Wow.
So,
I know you were giving me the heebie-jeebies when I'm hearing this.
I'm telling you, he was, when he related the story to me, he was shaking. And that was 2 weeks after it happened. He stopped by and he said, I have something I need to talk to you about. And then told me the story.
Yeah, especially when for them, at least a little girl, to be grinning, to know that they were causing fear. Okay, so that was my takeaway from that. That they're purposely there to cause fear, a fear reaction. That
Yeah,
and
and I
that
think
they
that's one
were
of the, go ahead.
no, I said, and that was their impetus for being there, because they didn't, from what you're saying, they didn't try to get into the car, they didn't try to do anything else, just stand there.
I think that if he would have gotten the window all the way down, they would have attempted it.
Okay.
They would have said, let me in. But one of the things I find interesting about the black-eyed children is that you have to invite them in. Like they will request it, but that until you give them permission, they can't. So probably the most famous story of black-eyed children that's ever been told is that of a guy named Brian Bethel. He's a journalist, a writer from Abilene, Texas. And this story started circulating in about 1996. So it's late in the afternoon. He's in a parking garage. He had forgotten to write a check for a bill. And so he decided to drop it off directly before they shut the store down where he needed to pay this bill. And he's sitting in his car in this parking garage writing out this check, getting ready to get out of the car, when he's approached by these two boys. And they knock on the window of his car, and he said he looked up and the fear just ran through him. They were just kids, but there was just something wrong about them. And in the parking garage, the lighting's a little wonky, and at first he wasn't sure what was wrong. He just had that terrible fear in the pit of your stomach feeling. And the one kid said, hey, we need a ride. And he shook his head and he said no. And he like my friend had started to wind the window down, and he said, you need to go. And the kids said, we need a ride to my mom's house. Please, we were going to the movies and we forgot our money. Can't you take us to a mom's house so we can get to the movie? And he knew there was a movie theater in the area, but he said, no, I'm not. And then the kid got a little more aggressive and he said, look, just let us in and we'll be gone before you know it. We need to get to our mother's house. And again, he said no. And he said by now he could see their eyes and they were pitch black, and there was no real substance in their eyes. It was just holes, and it was terrifying. So he's beginning to like wind the window up, and he's like, no, just go away. And one of the kids says, come on, mister, we won't hurt you. You have to let us in. We don't have a gun. And the more he spoke, the more Bethel got scared. And he reached up, kicked the car on, and put it in reverse and took off. And when he looked in his rearview mirror, they weren't there.
Absence of eyes, absence of souls.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's probably the most famous one. And he wrote about it, and it became this avalanche of people contacting him and saying, oh my God, I thought I was the only one who ever saw them. I've been keeping this story secret for so long. And people just began sharing all these stories of black-eyed encounters, mostly children, sometimes adults, but definitely mostly children. And it just became this crazy event, and he began collecting more and more and more stories, and people were just so relieved to have somebody to tell them to that may not think they were crazy, because they had an experience too. So that's kind of where the whole internet explosion of all of this came from. But that is not the first story I found on black-eyed children. I found a story from 1950 of a boy who encountered him. So there's a 16-year-old kid, and he's walking home, and he sees down this like country road, and he sees this boy leaning against a fence a little way in the distance. And he's, just thinks it's another kid hanging out, walking down there. 1950s, people did a lot more walking places than they do today. Today, if you have to walk a block, you'll call your mom and say, come get me. But
Yeah.
I can remember my brothers, who were young in that time frame in the 50s and 60s, talking about walking 4 and 5 miles into town to go to the movie on a, every night of the week, or go someplace in town and then walking home in the dark, and nobody thought anything about it. So this was not, that part of it wasn't so creepy. But anyhow, he saw the boy standing there leaning up against this fence rail, and he said hello, and the kid didn't answer him. He's just standing there staring at him. So he said, started to turn away, and that's when the boy spoke. And he said, I want to go to your home. You're going to walk me to your house. The boy turned around, and he said, in that moment, the moon came out from behind the clouds, and he said, I could see this kid's eyes were completely pitch black. And he said, all I could think in my head was, run now. And he said, I tried to, but my feet wouldn't go. I couldn't make a move. It was like I was glued to the ground. And the boy said to him in his head, not out loud this time, but in his head, now don't you go running away from me. You're going to walk me to your house. And at that, the paralysis broke, and the boy took off running. And he said behind him, he could hear this kid screaming. And he said it sounded like a bobcat. He said, I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see what it was, but it gave that long, almost like a woman screaming kind of bobcat sound. And he burst into the house when he got to his house down the road. And he was so terrified, his dad grabbed a gun, and they went out looking for whatever this was or whoever this was. And they couldn't find anyone. But whatever it was, it had terrified this kid so much that his mother actually believed that he had run into the devil. And she called their priest, who came out and blessed the boy in the house.
I think that would be a natural reaction. Something like that.
It would.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there are a lot of different suppositions about what they are. And I've read about, I don't know, maybe half a dozen different things people have come to believe they might be. So the first one is vampires, because they have that, they must have permission thing going on, much like vampires do. A vampire can't come into your home unless you invite it in. And that's the tradition.
Okay.
And so there's that, and that sort of lends credibility that it might be something like that. Others think it's demons, lizard people, a race of beings. I've come across a really interesting argument that they might be a race of beings that have been sharing this planet with us for thousands of years. They call themselves the serpent people, and they seem to be connected in some way to satanic practices. And I don't mean like, rites and things like that, but they'll talk about the coming of the dragon, their god, the dragon. They talk about the Garden of Eden, how they educated Eve. And of course, we always think of the serpent there from the Bible story. So there's a lot of really heavy negative connotations about them. And there was this really interesting article I read, which was supposedly an interview with one. Basically, this guy was writing about them, and this person wrote in and said, I am one. And I want to tell you, you have this wrong, and this is what it is. And he was explaining who they were and where they came from, and that they hide in the shadows because there's too many of us, but that they know that their time will come, and that they enjoy scaring us, that it basically brings them great fun and great joy. And if they can get close enough to us humans that they can harm us, they enjoy that. And there are stories. There's a story I remember reading years ago about a woman who went into a grocery store. Now, this would have been in 1970s or 80s. Back then, people left their kids in cars and would run into the store for a loaf of bread. You know that. It wasn't considered horrible like it is today, or dangerous like it is today. I don't know, maybe it was dangerous, but we didn't think of it that way. So this lady ran into the store to grab something really quick and left her 9-year-old son in the car. And when she comes back, she gets into the car and there's another kid sitting in the car with him. And she says, hello. And this kid's like, this is my friend and he's coming home with me and we're going to play. And the kid's got his head down, this stranger. So she like kind of leans into the car and she's like, what's your name? You know, and I'm sure she's thinking, I'm not kidnapping somebody else's kid. He just jumped in my car. So anyhow, the kid looks up and when he does, he says, drive. And that's when she sees his eyes, and his eyes are completely black, and she's panicked. The instincts as a mom have kicked in. This is terrible, and you know this is dangerous to her child. And she pulls open the car door and she says, "Get out." And the kid grins at her and he says, "Drive. Take me home. I want to play with your son." And she goes around and she starts to get into the car, and she sits down and she looks in the rearview mirror and the boy's watching her and he said, "Drive." And she says, no, get out of my car. And her son starts to cry and he's like, Mom, he's going to play with me. And she's like, he's getting out of the car now. And the kid just sits there for a moment and she says, I'm going to call the police. And he goes, oh, there's no need for that. I'll leave. And he gets out of the car. And she doesn't even let the car door shut. She just takes off down the street, pulls off into a parking lot further down the street, gets her son out of the car and goes into a store. She calls her husband, borrows a phone and calls her husband and tells him she can't drive. He needs to get there. She's so rattled. She's so terrified. So he comes and he switches vehicles with her. And she gets in his car and she puts their son in the car and she goes towards the house and he's following behind her. And all of a sudden, the car veers off the road that he's in and smashes into a wall. And she pulls over. She's terrified. And her husband's pretty, he's injured. He's hit his head on the windshield and everything. And he tells her that the steering wheel took over on its own and he couldn't use it. He couldn't drive. And it ran him into this wall. Well, he ends up in the hospital. She goes home. She's still creeped out about what's going on. And over the course of the next few weeks, her son gets really, really sick. Then she gets really, really sick. And they both almost die from their illnesses. Her husband's really sick and he's back in the hospital again. It's like whatever they encountered physically manifested illnesses for them. And she believed for the rest of her life that had they not encountered this entity, this boy with the black eyes, none of this would have happened. And the doctors didn't know what they were sick with. They couldn't say it was the flu or, they had cancer or anything. They were really sick.
The only word that comes to mind is wow. That's just
there are encounters where that's happened, where they've gotten physically into a home or something like that and made people ill.
So is that what happens if they finally do get into the house?
It seems to be one of the things that happen is that they seem to make people very, very sick if you get physically close to them in any way. So do they have some sort of virus or disease, or do they deliberately make you manifest it and make you sick? I don't know, but there have been multiple encounters where people have gotten that close to them and have lived to tell the tale. Now, there's, of course, other ones that maybe they don't live to tell the tale because they seem to be hell-bent to get in your house or your car, one of the two. Or even a business, if you're in a business. There's this really interesting story from, I believe it's Louisiana, about a guy who was working at a gas station in a kind of rural area. And one night, the middle of the night, like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, the lights go out. Everything goes out. And they have a emergency generator in the back. So he goes out back and he gets the generator going, and it's emergency lighting, so it's only softly lit.
Right.
The cashier area is lit, and the front door is lit a little bit, but not the whole facility, not like it normally would be. And he looks up at the cameras that, you know, pan. They have cameras that pan the outside and cameras for the inside, so you can see all of that. And they're on, and he can see these two kids walking out of the darkness, a boy and a girl, and they're standing like in front of the gas station looking at it, just staring at it. And he estimates the girl might have been about 8 or 9 years old. The boy was about 12, and they had on, he called them unusual clothing, old-timey clothes, but he couldn't really place a time period for them. And he's standing there watching these kids, and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and he's like, where the heck did they come from? Because there's nobody around. And the kids just walk right up to the door, and he goes over to the door like he's going to lock it, but instead he opens the door and he says, are you okay? And the girl looks up at him and says, I need to use your phone. And that's when he sees her eyes, and they're black. And he says, you can use the cell phone. And he hands it out the door, like cracks the door open and hands it out toward her. And she goes, no, I need to use your real one, and looks past him to the phone on the wall. And he says, no, you're not coming in. And he shuts the door and clicks the lock. And she said, I told you I need to use your real phone. And he's just standing there staring at him. And the kids finally, they turn and they walk about 10 feet away, and they just stand there staring at him, and he's staring at them through the glass. He can see their eyes, and in the distance he sees on the ground 2 bicycles laying. He hadn't noticed earlier. And eventually they walk over, pick up the bicycles, and walk away. They don't ride them, they just walk away pushing them. And he said that whenever the morning came, he got, help came in to relieve him. He went back and he thought, I'm gonna see this all on the surveillance footage, but they weren't on there.
I can't say I'm surprised.
No, I mean it's
No,
creepy to think that.
Seriously, I can't say that I'm surprised, because I've had experiences, and around my home and in places I do have surveillance cameras, and nothing. But I know that I've seen things. So
it is possible, but I mean, I think it happens more often than we realize, that we don't capture everything that's going on, or vice versa. I mean, that's one of the things about ghost hunting, is that, the idea is that you're going to capture stuff by just letting the camera run. And sometimes you do, but sometimes you also miss things. I've had both experiences through the years. So what do you think? What are your ideas on what these guys are?
I've got to say that from what you're describing, the first thing that comes through my head is they're minor demons. Okay, simply because they're manifesting as humans, but they're not quite right. There's something about them not quite right. Okay. They also manifest as children. I mean, so far you haven't told any stories about black-eyed adults. They've all been children. So as children, they're meant to, at least I think, they're meant to elicit some type of parental response. This is something that we here's a child all by themselves. We need to help that child. Or as another child is, like the kid in the back of the car, he's like, oh, he's my friend. We're going to come back to the house and play. So that's what I was, that's my first take.
Yeah.
I mean, the take that I have right now. I mean, that would be, I mean, just telling you telling me these stories, telling our audience these stories. I'm certainly getting, I'm goose pimples. Just from the hair standing up in my arms just from listening to them. So that's my take.
Yeah, they do have they do seem to be using our empathy and our instincts as human beings to take care of children.
Mm-hmm.
And that's usually how they present themselves, often as young kids. There's a story from Vermont, 2016, of a woman who actually let children into her house. So basically there was a blizzard going on. And she's absolutely shocked when she hears this knocking on her door, because
Mm-hmm.
everything is shut down. And excuse me. And so she looks out the window, and there's these 2 kids standing on her porch. There's no cars. There's nobody moving. They're just standing on the porch. And she feels this terrible feeling of dread. But there's these two instincts going on inside of her. One is fear, don't open the door. The other is, oh my God, these are children and they're not dressed for the weather. They don't have coats or anything on. And where did they come from? You need to help them. So she yells for her husband. She's like, hey, there's somebody out here. I need you to come down. And he's upstairs, and the kids continue to pound on the door. So finally, her husband comes down, and they open the door and are like, what's going on, guys? Where you come from? And they're like, we need to get help. And the lady said she noticed that she had 3 cats, and her cats were always real friendly. And the one cat hissed and took off back the hallway, and the other cats just disappeared. And she said that was just so not like them. And she said her husband asked her, are you lost? Do you want hot chocolate? And the kid said, no, we just need to wait in your house. Our parents will be here soon. So they let them in, despite their gut instinct, because they're kids and they don't have coats. And it's, 10 below zero blizzardy kind of weather. And she makes them hot chocolate. And they had kind of kept their heads tipped downward, and whenever they reached up to take the hot chocolate, that's when she saw the eyes. And that's when all bets were off. They had no eyes at all, just that jet black, no whites of the eye. So she freezes, and one of them says, I need to use your bathroom. And her husband points towards the bathroom. And that's when he turns around and looks at them. He sees them and sees the eyes for the first time himself. And he's kind of wondering why his wife's frozen. She's just standing there frozen holding the hot chocolates. And his nose starts to bleed. And then all the lights go out in the house. And the children are standing there in the room right at the doorway. And one of them says to her, it's okay. Our parents are here now. They go to the front door and they go out. She's standing there at the door waiting for them to leave. As soon as she sees them go out of the door, she slams the door, locks it, and looks out the window. And she says they get into this black car with these 2 very tall men in black suits. And then they left. And within months of the encounter, their cats were all found dead from blood hemorrhages. Her husband's nosebleeds would continue until he was diagnosed with skin cancer. And the woman began to suffer from chronic nosebleeds herself, and their health deteriorated. And she was absolutely convinced this all came about because of the black-eyed children.
Also, lending credence to the fact that they could be demons, that they want to cause harm to God's children,
Yes.
and that they want to cause pestilence and disease and fear. To me, that's the biblical definition of a demon.
I agree. I mean, they are definitely something otherworldly. I don't think that, and I don't know if they are from this planet, and they hide well, but whatever they are, they definitely bode no good for human beings. They enjoy our fear. They are getting something from us from that fear. I don't know what it is. And I think they are definitely getting something. There are stories of beings that eat fear.
So, well, Hollywood is rife with movies and stories like that of beings that do just that. They feed on fear.
And speaking as a person who works in the field of the paranormal some of the time, I have to tell you that we encounter entities like that all the time. Like when I go to a home and there's an entity, maybe not a ghost exactly, but even some negative ghosts will do that as well. Then I will tell people, you need to stop being afraid all the time because your fear is feeding them. And they get stronger and more powerful the more frightened you become. So the idea that there are entities out there eating that negative energy, that electromagnetic energy that we're producing, doesn't sound far-fetched to me at all.
I'm just shaking my head because I'd never heard of these stories before, and now I kind of wish I hadn't either. But
I'm sorry.
No, and as I said, when you tell the lights are on, yeah. So, yeah, I believe this is one episode that Mrs. Stew is not going to be wanting to listen to without Mr. Stew being present.
Oh, okay. Well, that's okay. But I think that's this is one of the creepiest things that I know of, frankly. How could you get much creepier than these kids? And they're not always little kids. There's a story I know about a guy who used to do a lot of Halloween decorating, and he was that guy. There's always that guy in the neighborhood who like puts everything out,
Sure.
and
Yep.
there's all those decorations, and he really goes over the top. Well, this gentleman was that guy, and his neighbors had noticed it for the next year that the following year he didn't decorate at all. In fact, he didn't turn on his light. He didn't have candy for the kids. Totally different, because he was the guy who had the costume and all the decorations, and his light was on, and he had the big bowls of candy, and he really got into Halloween. And
Sure.
so the following year, they all noticed, everybody in the neighborhood, that he didn't decorate anymore, and he didn't have any candy out for the kids or anything. And the neighbor happened to see him that evening as he was, closing up shop for his Halloween, and he said to him, he's like, "You don't have any decorations out this year. You not celebrating Halloween anymore?" And the guy said, "Nah, kind of not into it anymore." And he said, "Really? You always seem to be so into it." He's like, "Yeah, well, just not my thing anymore." And he's like, "Why?" And he said, "Well, had some weirdos last year, just kind of creeped me out, and I decided it was probably better to just leave it all alone, and not mess with it anymore." And they got to talking. So basically what he said is that the previous Halloween, he had been, about 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, he's got the lights off now, and he's kind of putting stuff, away from, getting things settled down for the night, battening down the hatches, when these two 17-year-old boys come up and pound on his door. And he's like, "What the heck? It's too late for Halloween, for trick-or-treaters. It's like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night now." And but he looks out, and to his surprise, he thought he had turned off the outside lights, but to his surprise, the porch light's still on. And he's like, "Well, crap, that's my fault. I left the light on. Could have swore I turned that thing off." So he grabs the bowl of candy and he heads out to the door to, give these kids the candy, swings the door open and yells, "Boo!" like he'd been doing all evening. And that's whenever he stops, because there stands these two boys. Like I said, they're about 16, 17 years old. They're not dressed in costumes. They just have like flannel shirts on. And he's absolutely terrified the minute he lays eyes on them. It's not just, because they're teenage boys. He's like, there's just instinctive fear that ran up his spine. And he's like, "Holy crap, I opened the door. This is bad. This is bad." He knew it in his heart. He shouldn't have opened the door. And then that's whenever he sees their eyes, and that they have no whites in their eyes. And at first he thought, okay, well, maybe they do have a costume on. Maybe this is contact lenses. It's Halloween.
Okay.
So he's trying to talk himself into this. He thinks that's pretty good idea. Maybe that's what it is. So he tries to smile at him, and he says, "Would you like some candy or something?" And the one boy shakes his head no, and he says, "We were lost. Can we come in and wait until our parents get here?" And he says, "No, no, I don't think so. I don't think you can come in." And he's absolutely terrified at this point. And they're like, "You need to let us in until our parents get here." And now he's running through all the scenarios in his head. Are they high? Are they going to rob him? What's going on? Why am I so scared? So he shuts the door and locks it. And they stand on the porch. And they're just standing there, staring at the door. And he kind of goes to the window and he looks, and he's like, "Are they going to break open one of the windows or something to get into the house? Because they're not going anywhere." And they start knocking on the door again. And he won't answer. He turns the television on and turns the volume up, and he's watching. So finally they go down the steps, and he's like, "Thank goodness, thank goodness." And at the time he had not heard about black-eyed children. He had no clue. He just thought this was a really creepy encounter. And so one day he's at work and he's talking to somebody, a friend of his, and he says, you know, tells him, he said, I had the craziest thing happen to me the other night. And he tells him the story of what had happened. And the friend of his is like, oh my God, you had an encounter with the black-eyed kids. And he's like, I've never heard of them. What are you talking about? That's an urban legend and all this. And he said, no, no. He's like, I'm telling you, I've met people who said that they're real. Well, the next day he's at home and his neighbor knocks on the door and he says, hey, did you have a really weird thing happen last night? And he's like, what are you talking about? And he's like, this is going to sound insane, but there were these two teenage boys that came up on my porch and they had like black eyes and they tried to talk me into letting them into the house. And I could have swore they came off your porch and I didn't. They said that you had let them in and given them candy. And he's like, and I felt bad, but it was really late. And like, did you let them in? And he's like, no, I didn't let them in. And he said, that's when I realized that they were like going house to house looking for a place to get into. There were no stories about anybody being robbed or anything like that, but just him and his neighbor who had seen this. And from that point forward, he decided he wasn't going to let them in and let anybody in his house anymore. So Halloween was no longer for trick or treat.
Yeah, I don't think I would want to celebrate it either, for that matter.
It's just, and like I said, these stories go from all over the world. It's not just an American phenomena. It's all over the world. And they come from the early 1900s and up. Now, I have to say there's probably these stories from earlier time periods as well, but they're probably couched in different language because we wouldn't think of them as black-eyed kids back then. We would have thought of them as demons, like you said. So they would be more of a demonic story. And I don't know that they would have been passed down. The internet has really changed everything that way.
What about in like Renaissance artwork? You know, we talked before about seeing, UFOs being painted into artwork. Are there any? I'm not saying as far back as like, let's say, cave paintings or anything like that, but any kind of artwork that would show, black-eyed or people with the lack of eyes, other than Dante's Inferno or something.
Yeah, there are pictures with very large black-eyed children, like very large eyes that are blackened, but there's a few of them, just a very few, and so there's not much of a record that way. There are a few things that are written, like in people's journals or newspaper accounts from certain areas where there might have been a rash of sightings. But they seem to have increased in intensity starting in the 20th century. And I don't know why.
Yeah, I was just looking for some time frame of like, whenever they first appeared, or have they just been with us all along and just there were no words to describe them.
If you believe that interview with that figure who said he was one, that he claims they've been with us for 6,000 years, that they intermingle among us, and that they can use their mind control power, if you will, to influence us to not notice their eyes or to make their eyes look normal and human for periods of time. And again, I'm going to come back to maybe that is part of why we have the legends of vampires, because they seem to have a lot of the same characteristics, or maybe at least it's a part of why we have those stories. But they just seem to instinctively enjoy encountering us and scaring us. And other than making people sick, the only other thing is the fear. Now, when I told you the story about the guy with the woman with the two children in the blizzard, and how that goes into maybe the Men in Black, because you got the strange old sedan with two men, tall, thin, pale men with black suits that pick them up. So are they part of that entire thing as well? And they're they're being sent out like scouts?
Well, that does beg the question, but
It does. So this is going to be an episode that leaves us with more questions than answers. But if anybody's had an experience and wants to share it, how can they do that?
well, we have a couple different ways. We've mentioned before the email address, paranormalist at theparanormalistpodcast.com. And they can also find us on Facebook. We have a Facebook page at The Paranormalist Podcast. You see a trend here. And then we also have a YouTube channel, which we would be very happy if you were to subscribe to. And that's also The Paranormalist Podcast with the word the in front of it, THE. Paranormalist Podcast, 3 words.
Yes. So please, subscribe, share. If you have things you want to hear about, let me know. I will endeavor to give you some great stories on those subjects. And let us know what you think of the stories of the black-eyed children. I have to tell you, they are, like I said, one of the 2 creepiest things I know.
Well, now it's one of the creepiest things I know, too. Thanks, Patty.
Sure, no problem. I'm happy to oblige.
Yeah.
So until the next time, I'm going to wish everybody a Happy New Year.
Thank you, Patty. Happy New Year to you and your family as well.